Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where the past lies down beside you and history stops breathing softly in the dark. You didn't just smother him with a pillow, you sang to him first. Thank you for letting these stories drift you into sleep, night after night. If they've helped quiet your thoughts, consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time the dreams usually take you. Tonight, you dress like a priest, whisper like a prophet, and sedate a kingdom with scripture and sandals. You rock a king to sleep with loyalty, and when he wakes, you're gone, and God has taken your side. Close your eyes. Feel the weight of your body, heavy under the covers, like a secret no one's found yet. Breathe slowly, like you're hiding it. Let your limbs go still. Let the hush settle around your chest, your throat, your thoughts. The air is warm, the sheets don't move, and somewhere behind your eyelids, a door creaks open into another century. There's stone beneath your feet, tapestries that don't quite block the wind. Candles drip beside altars and letters wait to be read, damning ones. A man kneels, whispering Latin, to a god that might be listening. Footsteps pause just outside the chamber. You don't move. You don't speak. You just watch. Because this is the night the Archbishop stops pretending to be asleep. Sleep well. The transformation of Thomas Becket in the summer of 1162 was so dramatic that witnesses wondered if Canterbury Cathedral had been struck by particularly theological lightning. The man who had entered the Archbishop's palace wearing silk emerged wearing sackcloth, as if he discovered that comfort was actually a sin and decided to repent with extreme prejudice. Gone were the imported wines that had made his chancellor's table legendary. In their place appeared water, occasionally flavoured with the kind of herbs that suggested penance rather than pleasure. The elaborate dish that had required multiple translators to pronounce were replaced by bread that seemed designed to mortify both jaw and soul. The man who had once employed specialists to maintain his wardrobe now wore the same rough robes until they achieved a patina of holiness that was probably more dirt than divinity. The hair shirt deserves special mention. This garment, designed by someone who clearly hated both hair and comfort, became Thomas's constant companion. He wore it under his archiepiscopal robes, a secret scratch that reminded him hourly of his new dedication to discomfort. Servants whispered that he'd taken to sleeping on bare boards, though whether this was spiritual devotion or just the logical extension of making everything in his life as unpleasant as possible remained unclear. His daily routine transformed from one of administrative efficiency to spiritual theatre. Where Chancellor Thomas had risen late to attack the day's governmental challenges, Archbishop Thomas rose before dawn to attack his own comfort. He attended every service, participated in every fast, and generally behaved like someone trying to make up for decades of luxury in a few months of aggressive piety. The foot-washing ceremonies became legendary for all the wrong reasons. In medieval England, where personal hygiene was more theoretical than practical, washing the feet of beggars was less a symbolic act and more a test of spiritual fortitude. Thomas approached it with the determination of someone who decided that if he was going to be holy, he was going to be competitively holy. He washed more feet with greater enthusiasm than any archbishop in living memory. His household, accustomed to the magnificent excess of the Chancellor years, struggled to adapt. Cooks trained in creating elaborate subtleties found themselves making gruel. Servants who'd specialised in maintaining silk were reassigned to patching rough wool. The wine steward, bereft of purpose in a suddenly obstinate household, took to organising the water with the dedication of someone refusing to admit their obsolescence. But it was in his administrative approach that the transformation became most apparent. The man who had helped Henry squeeze revenue from the church now defended ecclesiastical wealth with the passion of a convert. When royal officials came calling about tax assessments, they found an archbishop who could quote canon law with the fluency of someone who'd memorized it out of spite. The first major confrontation came over a simple matter of appointments. Henry, assuming business as usual, sent Thomas a list of preferred candidates for vacant church positions. In the past, Chancellor Thomas would have smoothly implemented these suggestions, perhaps improving on them. Archbishop Thomas sent the list back with theological arguments about why secular interference in church appointments was contrary to God's will, canonical tradition, and basic decency. Henry's reaction to this unexpected resistance was measured, which for Henry meant he only broke furniture in private. He tried reasoning with Thomas, sending carefully worded letters that reminded his friend of their shared goals. Thomas responded with equally carefully worded letters that suggested those goals had been worldly and therefore wrong. It was passive-aggressive correspondence elevated to an art form. The resignation of the chancellorship had been the first warning sign. When Thomas sent back the Great Seal of Office, he included a letter of such pious humility that it bordered on sarcasm. He couldn't serve two masters, he explained, conveniently forgetting that he'd been spectacularly good at serving multiple masters for most of his career. The seal arrived at court wrapped in cheap cloth rather than the silk that would have been typical of Chancellor Thomas, a detail that suggested either genuine conversion or extremely petty symbolism. As autumn arrived, the court began to realise this wasn't a phase. Thomas wasn't establishing his religious credentials before returning to his collaborative ways. He was, apparently, actually taking his job as Archbishop seriously, which no one had expected and everyone found inconvenient. Bishops who had opposed his appointment now found themselves with a champion they didn't quite trust. Royal officials who had worked with him for years found themselves facing an opponent who knew all their strategies. The excommunications began slowly, almost tentatively, as if Thomas was testing this new power. A minor noble who had seized church property found himself barred from the sacraments. A royal official who had overstepped his authority in a church court discovered that his soul was now in bureaucratic limbo. Each excommunication was precisely targeted, legally justified, and extremely irritating to Henry, who viewed them as declarations of independence. By November 1162, patterns had emerged that worried everyone. Thomas attended to his archiepiscopal duties with the same obsessive efficiency he'd brought to the chancellorship, but now that efficiency was directed toward defending church privileges rather than undermining them. He knew where every ecclesiastical body was buried, metaphorically speaking, because he'd helped bury half of them. His insider knowledge made him a uniquely dangerous opponent. The bishops found themselves in an awkward position. They had a champion they hadn't asked for, defending privileges they weren't sure needed such aggressive defense. Thomas's zeal made them nervous. His transformation from tax collector to tax protector was too sudden, too complete. Some suspected he was playing a longer game, though what that game might be nobody could guess. The common people, meanwhile, began to notice their new archbishop. The poor found their feet washed by someone who actually seemed to care about their poverty. The hungry found bread distributed with an enthusiasm that suggested the archbishop had discovered charity like some people discovered wine. Churches reported increased attendance, possibly because people wanted to see what outrageous thing their archbishop would do next. But it was in the matter of criminal clerks that the real conflict began to emerge. The church had long claimed the right to try its own members in ecclesiastical courts, where the worst punishment was typically defrocking rather than the creative deaths favoured by secular justice. It was a system that made theological sense. Priests were God's servants and should be judged by God's representatives, but practical nonsense when those priests committed very secular crimes. Henry wanted reform. If a clerk committed murder, he argued, they should face the same justice as any murderer. The fact that they could read Latin and had taken holy orders shouldn't exempt them from hanging. It was a reasonable position that had the disadvantage of challenging centuries of church privilege. Thomas's response was swift and theologically comprehensive. He produced arguments from scripture, canon law, and church fathers that would have bored anyone not professionally required to care. The gist was that trying clerks in secular courts after church courts had already judged them constituted double jeopardy, which was wrong in both human and divine law. It was a sophisticated argument that ignored the practical problem of murderous priests escaping real justice. The correspondence between king and archbishop became increasingly formal as their positions hardened. Gone were the friendly postscripts, the shared jokes, the casual assumption of agreement. In their place came carefully crafted arguments that managing to be both legally precise and personally wounding. Henry accused Thomas of forgetting his origins and his obligations. Thomas accused Henry of forgetting his soul and his boundaries. The court watched this deterioration, with the fascination of people observing a slow dimission disaster. Courtiers who had envied the Chancellor's influence now found themselves nostalgic for the days when Thomas had been predictably ambitious rather than unpredictably holy. The administrative systems Thomas had created continued to function, but without their architect's political sensitivity, they began to create friction where they'd once created efficiency. Winter came early in 1162, and with it came a chill in the relationship between church and crown that had nothing to do with weather. Thomas spent the season establishing himself as a new kind of archbishop, one who actually read the job description and took it seriously. He reformed Canterbury's administration with his characteristic efficiency, but now that efficiency served God rather than the king. He organized the cathedral archives, standardized procedures, and generally made the archiepiscopal office function like a well-oiled machine pointed directly at royal prerogatives. His letters to Rome displayed the same diplomatic genius he'd once employed for Henry, but now they sought papal support for ecclesiastical independence. He cultivated relationships with bishops across Europe, building a network that could support him against royal pressure. He was, in essence, using all the skills Henry had valued to oppose everything Henry wanted. The transformation extended to his theological knowledge. Thomas had always been intelligent, but now he applied that intelligence to mastering canon law with the dedication of someone preparing for war. He could cite precedents, quote authorities, and construct arguments that made royal lawyers weep with frustration. The merchant's son, who had risen through careful calculation, had become the archbishop, who calculated how to frustrate royal will at every turn. As Christmas 1162 approached, the contrast with the previous year could not have been more stark. In 1161, Thomas had been the magnificent chancellor, Henry's right hand, the architect of royal supremacy. Now he was the ascetic archbishop, God's servant, the defender of ecclesiastical privilege. The transformation was complete enough to make observers wonder if there had been two different people named Thomas Becket. Henry spent that Christmas in a fury that his courtiers described as festive in the way that volcanoes are warm. He had expected his friend to continue their partnership in different clothes. Instead, he had created his most formidable opponent, one who knew all his strategies, understood all his goals, and seemed determined to frustrate them all in the name of God. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define both men and shape English history. But as 1162 turned to 1163, there was still hope that friendship might overcome principle, that compromise might prevent conflict. That hope would prove as fragile as Thomas's abandoned silk robes, but for a brief moment it existed. Thomas ended the year in prayer, wrapped in his hair shirt and his certainty. Henry ended it in rage, wrapped in his power and his confusion. Neither man yet understood that they had begun a dance that could only end when one of them stopped moving. But that understanding would come soon enough, and with it would come consequences neither could have imagined when Henry first decided to make his friend an archbishop. The year 1163 opened with the kind of ecclesiastical enthusiasm that made royal administrators reach for their strongest wine. Thomas Becket, now fully transformed into his role as Archbishop of Canterbury, had discovered excommunication the way some people discover exercise, with the zealous belief that more must be better. His approach to church discipline combined the administrative efficiency of his chancellor days with the moral certainty of someone who'd recently discovered they had principles. Nobles who had grown comfortable seizing church lands for temporary use found themselves receiving letters that managed to be both legally precise and spiritually terrifying. The excommunications were delivered with surgical precision, targeting not just the offenders but their entire household, because apparently in medieval justice, guilt by association was a feature, not a bug. The case of William of Ainsford became the first major test. This nobleman had claimed the right to appoint priests to churches on his land, a practice as old as Norman conquest and about as theologically sound. When the priest he'd appointed turned out to be spectacularly corrupt, even by medieval standards, where the bar was buried somewhere beneath the church floor, Thomas intervened with the subtlety of a battering ram. First came the letters, written in the kind of Latin that suggested Thomas had been saving his best vocabulary for just such an occasion. When William ignored them, presumably because he couldn't read Latin or chose not to, Thomas escalated. The excommunication was announced with full ceremony, complete with bell, book and candle, though the bell was probably unnecessary given how loudly Thomas was making his point. William's response was predictably medieval. He complained to the king. Henry, who was beginning to develop a permanent headache shaped remarkably like a mitre, summoned Thomas to explain why he was excommunicating nobles for doing what nobles had always done. Thomas arrived armed with precedents, canonical authorities, and the kind of self-righteousness that made everyone else in the room feel vaguely guilty about something. The meeting was a masterclass in two brilliant men talking past each other. Henry argued for practical governance and traditional arrangements. Thomas countered with theological imperatives and papal declarations. Henry pointed out that England had functioned perfectly well, with secular involvement in church appointments. Thomas suggested that functioning and damned weren't mutually exclusive states. But it was in the matter of criminous clerks that the real battle lines were drawn. The issue had been simmering since Thomas's appointment, but in 1163 it boiled over with the case of Philip de Broye. This canon of Bedford had been accused of murdering a knight, which even by the relaxed standards of medieval clergy seemed excessive. The case should have been straightforward. Murder was murder, regardless of whether the murderer could recite the Paternoster in Latin. Thomas, however, saw it differently. Philip de Broye was a clerk, therefore he fell under ecclesiastical jurisdiction. The church court tried him, found the evidence insufficient, possibly because the main witness was inconveniently dead, and acquitted him. When royal officials protested this obvious miscarriage of justice, Thomas responded with canonical arguments that essentially boiled down to, not your jurisdiction, not your problem. Henry's reaction was volcanic. Here was a clear case where church privilege was shielding criminals from justice, and his own archbishop was not just defending the system, but celebrating it. He demanded that clerks convicted in church courts be handed over to secular authorities for punishment. Thomas countered that this would constitute double jeopardy, trying the same person twice for the same crime, which was against both divine and natural law. The theological tennis match that followed would have been entertaining if it hadn't involved the fundamental structure of English justice. Henry quoted biblical passages about rendering unto Caesar. Thomas quoted different passages about the sanctity of God's servants. Henry cited Roman law. Thomas cited canon law. Both men displayed impressive erudition and equally impressive stubbornness. Behind the theological arguments lay practical concerns. Henry knew that church courts were notoriously lenient. A clerk who committed murder might lose his position and be confined to a monastery, where the hardship of regular meals and scheduled prayers apparently constituted sufficient punishment. Meanwhile, secular criminals faced hanging, mutilation, or creative combinations thereof. The disparity offended both justice and common sense. Thomas knew all this, of course. He'd helped Henry reform secular justice and understood its effectiveness. But he'd discovered something more important than effectiveness: principle. The church's independence wasn't just about protecting murderous clerks. It was about maintaining a sphere of authority separate from royal power. Give ground on criminal clerks today, and tomorrow the king would be appointing bishops and taxing monasteries. It was the medieval equivalent of a slippery slope argument, except the slope was real and everyone could see where it led. The bishops watched this escalating conflict with increasing alarm. Many privately agreed with Henry that criminal clerks were a problem. A few murderous priests were giving the entire clergy a bad name, and church courts' leniency was becoming embarrassing. But Thomas's defense of ecclesiastical privilege was so fierce, so absolute, that opposing him seemed dangerous. He had become the unexpected champion of church independence, and champions had a tendency to demand loyalty from their followers. Some bishops tried to mediate, suggesting compromises that would preserve church dignity while allowing actual justice. Perhaps clerks convicted of serious crimes could be defrocked first, then handed over to secular authorities as laymen. Thomas rejected this with arguments so complex they required footnotes. Perhaps church courts could impose harsher sentences. Thomas explained why this would violate the church's maternal mercy. Every compromise was rejected with theological precision and increasing vehemence. The royal administrators, meanwhile, began collecting statistics on clerical crime. The numbers were embarrassing. In some dioceses, clerks committed proportionately more crimes than laymen, possibly because they knew the consequences would be minimal. The image of the church as a sanctuary for criminals was becoming harder to dispute, which made Thomas's defense of the system even more frustrating to those who had to maintain actual law and order. Thomas responded to these criticisms by investigating clerical misconduct himself. but not to reform the system, rather to prove that the church was perfectly capable of policing itself. He held visitations, interviewed witnesses, and occasionally actually punished wrongdoers, though the punishments remained notably non-fatal. It was reform theatre, designed to show that ecclesiastical justice worked while ensuring it didn't work too harshly. His administrative reforms of the Canterbury diocese continued with mechanical precision. He organised the cathedral records with the same efficiency he'd once applied to royal archives. He standardised procedures for everything from ordinations to excommunications. He created what amounted to an ecclesiastical bureaucracy that could match the royal administration procedure for procedure, delay for delay. The irony wasn't lost on observers. Thomas was using all the skills Henry had valued to create a system that could effectively oppose Henry. He knew how royal government worked because he'd built half of it. He knew its weaknesses because he'd tried to fix them. He knew its strengths because he'd created them. It was like watching someone use their own inventions against them, which for Henry must have been particularly galling. As spring turned to summer in 1163, the conflict took on new dimensions. Thomas began corresponding with Pope Alexander III, seeking papal support for his position. His letters were masterpieces of diplomatic prose, combining legal argument with emotional appeal. He presented himself as the defender of church liberty against royal tyranny, conveniently forgetting his own years as the agent of that supposed tyranny. The Pope, dealing with his own problems, including an anti-pope, and the Holy Roman Emperor, responded with carefully crafted ambiguity. He supported church privileges in principle, while hoping everyone would calm down in practice. His letters to Thomas contained enough encouragement to keep him fighting, but not enough to fully commit papal authority to the conflict. It was diplomatic fence-sitting elevated to high art. Henry, not to be outdone, sent his own envoys to Rome. They presented the king's case with equal eloquence, portraying Thomas as an ungrateful subject who'd forgotten his proper place. The papal curia, accustomed to such disputes, listened to both sides and made sympathetic noises, while secretly hoping the problem would resolve itself without requiring actual papal intervention. Back in England, the practical consequences of the dispute were mounting. Royal justice and ecclesiastical justice were increasingly at odds. Criminals learned to claim clerical status to avoid secular courts. Actual clerks grew bolder in their misconduct, knowing their archbishop would protect them. The parallel justice systems that had coexisted uncomfortably for centuries were now actively competing. Thomas's excommunications became more frequent and more pointed. He targeted not just those who directly challenged church authority, but those who enabled such challenges. Royal officials who tried to arrest clerks found themselves barred from the sacraments. Nobles who supported the king's position discovered their souls were in administrative limbo. The spiritual weapon was being deployed with increasing frequency and decreasing discrimination. The other tool in Thomas's arsenal was the interdict, the nuclear option of medieval ecclesiastical warfare. An interdict shut down all religious services in an area, meaning no masses, no marriages, no baptisms, no Christian burials. In an age when most people believed such services were essential for salvation, it was a terrifying weapon. Thomas began threatening interdicts against regions that supported royal policy too enthusiastically. Henry's response was to threaten countermeasures. If Thomas could use spiritual weapons, Henry could use temporal ones. Church lands could be seized, ecclesiastical revenues could be confiscated, bishops could be exiled. The king had cards to play, and he began showing them with increasing openness. By autumn 1163, England was effectively experiencing a cold war between church and crown. Both sides were armed, both were threatening, but neither had yet pulled the trigger on full conflict. It was an exhausting state of tension that couldn't last but seemed unable to end. The Council of Westminster in October 1163 was supposed to resolve the dispute. Henry summoned all the bishops to clarify, once and for all, the relationship between royal and ecclesiastical justice. He arrived with proposals that he considered reasonable compromises. Thomas arrived with theological arguments and a determination to compromise nothing. The council was a disaster. Henry demanded that the bishops agree to his reforms. Thomas rallied the bishops to resist. The debates were acrimonious, the atmosphere poisonous. Bishop turned against bishop, with some supporting the king and others their archbishop. The unified front of the English church cracked under the pressure of choosing sides. Thomas's speech to the assembly was a masterpiece of ecclesiastical rhetoric. He invoked saints, quoted scripture, and painted a picture of royal tyranny that would have been more convincing if everyone hadn't remembered him enthusiastically enforcing that tyranny just 2 years earlier. But his passion was genuine, his arguments were sophisticated, and his determination was absolute. Henry's response was more direct. He reminded the bishops that they held lands from the crown, that their temporal power derived from royal grant, and that what the king had given, the king could take away. It wasn't subtle, but it was effective. Several bishops began reconsidering their positions with the speed of men who just remembered they enjoyed eating. The council ended without resolution. Neither side had won, but both had shown their weapons. The bishops dispersed to their dioceses, confused and worried. Thomas returned to Canterbury, more determined than ever. Henry retired to nurse his rage and plan his next move. As 1163 drew to a close, the transformation of Thomas Becket was complete. The King's Chancellor had become the Church's champion. The architect of royal supremacy had become the defender of ecclesiastical independence. The friend had become the enemy, though neither man would have used that word yet. But the conflict was now inevitable. Two brilliant, stubborn men had taken positions from which retreat was impossible. The question was no longer whether they would clash, but how catastrophically. The answer would come soon enough, and it would reshape England in ways neither could have imagined. January 1164 arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made everyone in England question their life choices, particularly those involving outdoor assemblies and political confrontations. Henry II, having spent Christmas nursing his grievances like a special vintage wine, decided that subtle diplomacy had failed, and it was time for the medieval equivalent of a legal sledgehammer. The summons to Clarendon Palace was drafted with the kind of formal courtesy that barely concealed its menace. All bishops were invited to attend a great council to clarify the customs governing church-state relations. The quotation marks were implicit but understood by everyone. This wasn't going to be a discussion, it was going to be a royal decree disguised as a consultation. Thomas received his summons at Canterbury, where he was engaged in his new favourite activity, making everyone uncomfortable with his holiness. He read the king's letter while wearing his hair shirt, which probably influenced his interpretation. The invitation to Clarendon felt less like a summons to council and more like a summons to surrender. His journey to Clarendon was a medieval passion play in motion. He travelled slowly, stopping at every church to pray, distributing alms with the enthusiasm of someone trying to buy divine intervention with other people's money. His entourage, used to the efficient travels of his chancellor days, found themselves participants in a mobile religious retreat. Meanwhile, Henry prepared Clarendon like a general preparing a battlefield. The palace was filled with royal supporters, armed men who happened to be in the area, and legal experts who'd been thoroughly briefed on what expertise to provide. The Great Hall was arranged to maximise royal authority and minimise ecclesiastical comfort. This was theatre, and Henry was director, producer, and lead actor. The other bishops arrived with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some came hoping for compromise, others expecting disaster, and a few probably hoping to switch sides depending on how the wind blew. They found Clarendon transformed into an armed camp where the weapons were legal precedents and the ammunition was royal displeasure. The council opened on January 25th, 1164, with Henry presenting his case with the reasonableness of someone who'd already decided the outcome. He wasn't, he assured everyone, trying to diminish the church. He merely wanted to clarify the ancient customs of the realm, the traditional relationship between crown and church that had worked so well for their ancestors. The fact that these ancient customs had been hastily compiled by royal lawyers over the past few weeks was politely ignored. History, as Henry understood it, was whatever supported royal prerogative. The 16 clauses he presented were a masterwork of legal fiction dressed as historical fact. The constitutions of Clarendon, as these clauses would be known, were breathtaking in their scope. Criminous clerks would be tried in church courts, but, if found guilty, would be degraded and handed over to secular justice. Appeals to Rome would require royal permission. Bishops couldn't leave the kingdom without royal consent. Excommunications of royal officials would need royal approval. It was everything Henry wanted, wrapped in the language of tradition and precedent. Thomas listened to the reading of these constitutions with the expression of someone discovering that his dinner had been poisoned and was being expected to eat it anyway. Each clause was a dagger aimed at ecclesiastical independence. Together, they would reduce the church to a department of state, with the Archbishop as a particularly ornate civil servant. The debate that followed was less debate and more orchestrated pressure. Royal supporters argued for the reasonableness of the customs. Moderate bishops suggested that perhaps some compromise could be found. Thomas stood increasingly alone, his opposition growing more absolute with each clause discussed. The pressure was intense and multifaceted. Henry alternated between rage and reasonableness, threatening and cajoling by turns. The other bishops pressed Thomas to yield, pointing out that opposition was futile and possibly fatal. Even those who agreed with him in principle urged him to agree in practice, preserving himself to fight another day. For 3 days, Thomas held out. He argued, he quoted canon law, he invoked papal authority, but he was one man against the assembled might of the kingdom. The bishops who might have supported him were cowed by royal pressure. His own advisers urged submission. He was isolated, exhausted, and facing the very real possibility of arrest or worse. On the 3rd day, something broke. Whether it was his nerve, his judgment, or simply his energy, Thomas suddenly capitulated. He agreed to the constitutions, promised to observe them, and instructed the other bishops to do likewise. The surrender was so sudden and complete that even Henry seemed surprised. The hall erupted in relief. The crisis was over, the Archbishop had submitted, and everyone could go home. Henry was magnanimous in victory, embracing Thomas and speaking of their renewed friendship. The bishops hurried to add their seals to the document, eager to end this uncomfortable episode. Wine was brought out, toasts were made, and for a moment it seemed that the conflict between church and crown had been resolved through the simple expedient of royal intimidation. But Thomas's capitulation lasted exactly as long as it took him to leave Clarendon and realise what he'd done. By the time he reached Canterbury, the full horror of his surrender had sunk in. He had betrayed his office, his principles, and, most importantly, his newly discovered sense of himself as God's champion. The guilt was overwhelming. His penance was immediate and dramatic. He suspended himself from priestly functions, as if his betrayal had made him unworthy to approach the altar. He fasted even more severely than usual, which, given his already austere diet, was an achievement. He wore his hair shirt constantly, adding chains for good measure, because apparently simple discomfort was insufficient for such a betrayal. More importantly, he wrote to the Pope. The letter was a masterpiece of self-recrimination and excuse-making. He had been pressured, surrounded, threatened. He had yielded in a moment of human weakness. He begged for absolution, and more practically, for release from his oath to observe the constitutions. It was the medieval equivalent of claiming a contract was signed under duress, which it essentially was. While waiting for the papal response, Thomas began his counter-offensive. He refused to seal the constitutions, claiming technical irregularities. He questioned their validity, suggesting that ancient customs couldn't contradict canon law. He began finding reasons why each clause was problematic, heretical, or at least highly questionable. It was legal guerrilla warfare, and Thomas was very good at it. Henry's reaction to this about-face was predictable and violent. He had thought the matter settled, only to discover that Thomas's agreement had been as temporary as morning dew. The king's rage was spectacular, featuring creative profanity in multiple languages, and threats that would have been anatomically impossible but were emotionally satisfying. The bishops found themselves whipsawed between king and archbishop. They had sealed the constitutions on Thomas's instruction, only to find him repudiating them. They were bound by their oaths, but released by their archbishop's example. Most chose the safest path, doing nothing while looking very busy doing it. Pope Alexander III's response, when it finally arrived, was a masterpiece of diplomatic equivocation. He understood Thomas's difficult position. He appreciated the pressures involved. He couldn't formally release Thomas from his oath, but suggested that perhaps some accommodation could be found. He sent papal legates to mediate, which was like sending marriage counsellors to a knife fight. Thomas took the papal response as vindication. If the Pope wouldn't explicitly condemn his repudiation of the constitutions, that was practically endorsement. He became more intransigent, more righteous, more insufferably certain that he was on the side of the angels. The fact that the angels hadn't actually weighed in on the matter was a detail he chose to ignore. Spring 1164 saw an escalation in hostilities. Henry began legal proceedings against Thomas on various charges, most of them creative interpretations of financial irregularities from his time as Chancellor. It was harassment through litigation, a technique that would be familiar to modern observers but was relatively innovative in medieval England. Thomas responded by excommunicating anyone involved in prosecuting him, which was like trying to stop a flood with strongly worded letters. The excommunications flew thick and fast, targeting royal officials, hostile bishops, and anyone else who annoyed the Archbishop. It was spiritual warfare, conducted with bureaucratic precision. The situation was becoming untenable. England effectively had two parallel power structures, each claiming ultimate authority. Royal writs competed with ecclesiastical decrees, secular courts and church courts issued contradictory judgments. The administration that Thomas had helped create was being used against the ecclesiastical system he now defended. It was governmental civil war, conducted with parchment and seals, rather than swords and shields. By summer 1164, even Thomas's supporters were growing weary. His intransigence was admirable in principle, but exhausting in practice. His excommunications were creating more problems than they solved. His refusal to compromise was pushing the conflict toward a crisis that nobody wanted, but everybody could see coming. The papal legates attempted to mediate, shuttling between king and archbishop with proposals that satisfied neither. They suggested compromises that Thomas rejected as betrayals and Henry dismissed as inadequate. Their efforts were well-meaning but futile, like trying to reconcile fire and water by suggesting they meet in the middle. As autumn approached, the legal harassment intensified. Thomas was summoned to answer charges that grew more serious with each iteration. What had begun as financial irregularities evolved into accusations of contempt and treason. The legal machinery that Thomas had helped perfect was being turned against him with ruthless efficiency. The Clarendon Trap had closed, but not in the way Henry had intended. Instead of forcing Thomas into submission, it had forced him into opposition so complete that reconciliation was impossible. The Archbishop, who had briefly agreed to the constitutions, was now their most implacable enemy. The conflict that might have been resolved through compromise was now heading toward catastrophe. Thomas prepared for the worst while hoping for divine intervention. He instructed his household in what to do if he was arrested. He made provisions for the continuation of archiepiscopal authority if he was imprisoned. He was like a general preparing for a siege, except the fortress was his own position and the enemy was his former friend. The summons to Northampton in October 1164 would be the final act in this phase of the drama. Henry was preparing a legal spectacular that would either break Thomas or destroy him. Thomas was preparing for martyrdom, though he probably hoped it would be more metaphorical than literal. Both men were trapped by their own choices, their own principles, and their own inability to remember that in medieval politics, flexibility was often the key to survival. The Clarendon Trap had been sprung, but it had caught both hunter and prey. Henry had his constitutions, but not the submission that would make them effective. Thomas had his principles, but not the power to enforce them. Both men had painted themselves into corners from which escape seemed impossible. The only question was who would be forced to make the first catastrophic move. The summons to Northampton arrived at Canterbury, wrapped in enough legal formality to suggest that someone had been reading law books with vindictive enthusiasm. Thomas was commanded to appear before the royal court in October 1164 to answer charges that started with financial irregularities and escalated to accusations that would have made Judas Iscariot seem like a model of loyalty. Thomas prepared for Northampton like a man preparing for his own execution, which, given Henry's mood, wasn't entirely unrealistic. He gathered his supporters, such as they were, organised his legal defence, such as it was, and most importantly, prepared his spiritual armour, which consisted mainly of prayers and an even itchier hair shirt than usual. The journey to Northampton was a medieval tragedy in motion. Thomas travelled with a small entourage, having learned that large retinues made convenient targets for royal harassment. He stopped at churches along the way, praying with the kind of intensity that suggested he was trying to build up spiritual credit for whatever was coming. Northampton Castle in October was as welcoming as a grave with architectural pretensions. The Great Hall had been prepared for what was clearly going to be less a trial and more a carefully choreographed humiliation. Royal supporters filled every available space. Armed men stood at every entrance, their presence a reminder that medieval justice often came with sharp edges. Henry had assembled a judicial dream team of bishops and barons who owed him favours, feared his wrath, or simply enjoyed watching powerful men fall. They sat in judgment like vultures in expensive robes, waiting for the feast of Thomas's destruction to begin. The charges were read with the kind of detail that suggested someone had been keeping very careful records. As Chancellor, Thomas had handled enormous sums. Now, every penny was questioned. Amounts that had been spent on Henry's wars were presented as embezzlement. Diplomatic gifts that had smoothed international relations were reframed as personal theft. It was creative accounting in reverse, turning years of loyal service into a catalogue of crimes. Thomas's defence was legally sound but politically futile. He produced records, cited precedents, and pointed out that everything he'd done as Chancellor had been at Henry's explicit instruction. The judges nodded politely and continued with their predetermined verdict. It was like arguing with an avalanche about the finer points of gravity. The first day ended with Thomas being fined an astronomical sum for contempt of court, apparently for having the temerity to defend himself. He was given until the next day to pay, which was like giving someone until tomorrow to grow wings. His supporters scrambled to raise the money, borrowing from anyone who hadn't already chosen sides in this increasingly bitter conflict. Day 2 brought new charges and new fines. The accusations grew more creative as the proceedings continued. Thomas was accused of everything short of causing bad weather and disappointing harvests, though given more time, Henry's lawyers probably would have found precedents for those too. But it was on the third day that the proceedings took a truly sinister turn. The charge of treason was introduced with a kind of casual malice that suggested it had been the goal all along. Thomas had, according to the prosecution, betrayed his oath of loyalty to the king by opposing royal will. The fact that he was opposing it, in his capacity as Archbishop, was deemed irrelevant. Loyalty to the king superseded all other obligations, including those to God. Thomas's response was magnificent in its defiance. He appeared in full archiepiscopal regalia, carrying his metropolitan cross like a weapon. He'd celebrated Mass that morning using the liturgy for St. Stephen, the first martyr, which was about as subtle as a declaration of war. When he entered the hall, the impact was immediate. This wasn't a defendant. This was a prince of the church making a statement. The trial proceeded with increasing acrimony. Royal prosecutors presented their case with vindictive precision. Thomas responded with theological arguments that sailed over the heads of most present, but sounded impressively defiant. The bishops were caught between their ecclesiastical superior and their temporal one, most choosing the expedient path of looking at their feet and hoping not to be called upon. When it became clear that the verdict would be guilty and the sentence would be severe, imprisonment at best, death at worst, Thomas played his last card. He appealed to Rome, placing himself under papal protection and effectively internationalizing what had been a domestic dispute. It was a brilliant legal maneuver that also happened to be incredibly irritating to everyone who just wanted this mess concluded. The court exploded in chaos. Royal supporters demanded Thomas be seized immediately. Ecclesiastical supporters, the few who remained, argued that touching an archbishop under papal protection would result in excommunication. Legal arguments flew like arrows in a particularly erudite battle. Thomas stood in the centre of it all, clutching his cross and looking remarkably pleased with himself for a man facing imminent imprisonment. But Thomas had one more surprise. As the court descended into chaos, he simply walked out. Not dramatically, not quickly, but with the measured pace of someone who had decided that the proceedings had become too undignified for his participation. He walked through the great hall, past the shouting judges, past the confused guards, and out into the October evening. The escape that followed was part farce, part thriller, and entirely medieval. Thomas returned to his lodgings, where his supporters had already begun planning his flight. Disguises were procured, though disguising someone as distinctively tall and austere as Thomas was challenging. Routes were planned, horses prepared, and prayers said with particular fervour. As night fell, Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, primate of all England, defender of ecclesiastical privilege, became Thomas the Fugitive. He left Northampton disguised as a monk, which, given his recent lifestyle choices, required minimal costume change. His escape route was circuitous, designed to confuse pursuit, though it probably confused Thomas's own party as much as any hypothetical pursuers. The journey to the coast was a medieval nightmare of bad weather, worse roads, and constant fear of capture. Thomas travelled by night, hid by day, and generally experienced all the discomforts of being a wanted man in an age before proper hotels or reliable maps. His companions later reported that he maintained his prayer schedule throughout, which must have been challenging when trying to remain inconspicuous. Meanwhile, Henry discovered Thomas's flight with the kind of rage that probably registered on seismographs, had they existed. The king's fury was spectacular, even by his standards. Orders flew out for Thomas's arrest, for the seizure of Canterbury properties, for various creative punishments for anyone who had aided the escape. It was medieval government at its most efficiently vindictive. But Thomas was already beyond Henry's reach. He had made it to the coast, where sympathisers had arranged passage to France. The Channel crossing was reportedly terrible, with storms that seemed personally offended by archiepiscopal presumption. Thomas spent the voyage praying, and probably reconsidering the wisdom of antagonising someone with as much temporal power as Henry. He landed in France on November 2, 1164, beginning an exile that would last 6 years. King Louis VII of France, ever happy to annoy his English rival, received Thomas with open arms and barely concealed delight. Here was the perfect tool for making Henry's life difficult, his own archbishop, in exile, claiming persecution, and available for whatever diplomatic mischief Louis could devise. Back in England, Henry's rage settled into cold determination. He seized Canterbury's revenues, expelled Thomas's supporters, and generally acted like a man who'd been personally betrayed by someone he'd trusted, which, from his perspective, he had been. The friend who was supposed to smooth church-state relations had instead become their greatest obstacle. The English bishops found themselves in an impossible position. Their archbishop was in exile, their king was furious, and they were caught between conflicting loyalties. Most chose the pragmatic path of nominal obedience to the king, while secretly hoping Thomas would either compromise or conveniently die. Neither seemed likely, given Thomas's talent for both stubbornness and survival. The Northampton trial had been intended to break Thomas, to force him into submission, or at least silence. Instead, it had transformed him into something more dangerous than a difficult archbishop. He was now a symbol, a living martyr, a cause célèbre for anyone who opposed royal authority or simply enjoyed good political theatre. From his French exile, Thomas began his campaign of letters, excommunications, and general ecclesiastical warfare. He had escaped the trap, but at the cost of everything except his principles. He was free, but freedom in exile was its own kind of imprisonment. He had defied the king, but defiance without power was merely gesture. The Cloaks and Daggers of Northampton had failed to capture Thomas, but they had succeeded in creating a crisis that would define the rest of Henry's reign. The financial charges had been exposed, as the pretexts they were. The real issue, whether the king or the church had ultimate authority, remained unresolved, and was now complicated by personal betrayal and public humiliation. As 1164 drew to a close, Thomas settled into exile, while Henry settled into resentment. Both men had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. The archbishop who had fled in disguise would return eventually, but he would return changed by exile and hardened by persecution. The king who had driven him out would welcome him back eventually, but the welcome would be as false as the charges at Northampton. The debt of betrayal, accumulated over months of conflict, would require payment. In medieval politics, such debts were usually paid in blood, but that payment was still years away. For now, Thomas was free but exiled, defiant but powerless, righteous but alone. It was victory of a sort, but the kind of victory that felt remarkably like defeat. The Channel crossing of November 1164 was the kind of maritime adventure that made even hardened sailors question their career choices. Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury and now England's most wanted ecclesiastical fugitive, spent the voyage alternating between prayers and what his companions delicately described as offerings to the sea. It seemed even the elements were taking sides in this conflict, and they weren't favouring the Archbishop. Thomas landed at Grey Lines looking like a man who'd wrestled with both temporal and meteorological powers and lost to both. His disguise as a simple monk was somewhat undermined by his height, his bearing, and the fact that simple monks rarely travelled with companions who kept calling him "Your Grace" before remembering they weren't supposed to. The immediate problem was where to go. France was welcoming but complicated, being full of French people who had their own opinions about everything. Thomas needed sanctuary, and more importantly, he needed to reach King Louis VII before Henry's envoys could poison the diplomatic well with their version of events. The journey to the French court was a study in contrasts. Thomas, who as Chancellor had travelled with magnificent retinues and elaborate ceremony, now moved like a refugee. His companions were few, his resources limited, and his future uncertain. Yet there was something liberating about the simplicity. For the first time in years, Thomas wasn't managing vast households or complex administrations. He was just a man with principles, running from a king who didn't share them. Louis VII received Thomas at Soissons with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for unexpected gifts that also happened to annoy your enemies. The French king was everything Henry wasn't, pious to the point of simplicity, cautious where Henry was impulsive, and delighted to have leverage against his more powerful rival. Thomas's arrival was like Christmas coming early. If Christmas involved exiled archbishops and international diplomatic crises, the meeting between Louis and Thomas was medieval political theatre at its finest. Louis played the role of the pious king, shocked by the persecution of a prince of the church. Thomas played the martyred archbishop, driven from his see by royal tyranny. Both men knew they were performing, but the performance served their purposes. Louis got a tool against Henry, Thomas got protection, and more importantly, legitimacy. The French court's reception of Thomas sent ripples across Europe. Here was the Archbishop of Canterbury in exile, under French protection. It was a scandal, an opportunity, and a complication, depending on your perspective. Papal envoys took notes, imperial ambassadors calculated implications. Everyone wondered what Henry would do next. Henry's response was predictably multifaceted. Official envoys were dispatched to demand Thomas's extradition, using legal arguments that sounded impressive until you remembered that medieval international law was more suggestion than system. Unofficial agents were sent to make Thomas's life difficult through various creative means. Threatening letters arrived with the regularity of seasonal complaints about the weather. But Thomas had found his stage. From exile, he could be what he couldn't be in England, a pure symbol of ecclesiastical resistance to royal tyranny. He didn't have to deal with the messy realities of actually running a diocese or managing church-state relations. He could focus entirely on being right, which he did with remarkable enthusiasm. His first major action was to excommunicate everyone involved in his persecution. The excommunications flew from France like particularly vindictive carrier pigeons. The Bishop of London, excommunicated for supporting the king. The Bishop of Salisbury, excommunicated for not supporting the Archbishop enough. Various royal officials, excommunicated for existing in ways that annoyed Thomas. It was spiritual warfare conducted with bureaucratic precision. The excommunications created their own problems. English bishops found themselves spiritually severed from the church while still trying to run their dioceses. It was like being fired while still having to show up for work. Some ignored the excommunications, reasoning that distance diluted spiritual authority. Others panicked, seeking absolution through increasingly desperate means. Thomas settled at the Cistercian Abbey of Pontigny, where the austerity suited both his circumstances and his new self-possession. The Cistercians, who prized simplicity and prayer, found themselves hosting the most complicated and political refugee imaginable. Thomas threw himself into monastic life with characteristic intensity, out-praying the monks and out-fasting the ascetics. His daily routine at Pontigny was punishing even by medieval monastic standards. He rose before the monks for private prayer, attended all services, and spent hours in study and correspondence. The correspondence was key. Thomas maintained a letter-writing campaign that would have exhausted a team of modern public relations professionals. He wrote to everyone: the Pope, cardinals, bishops, abbots, kings, and anyone else who might be useful or at least sympathetic. The letters were masterpieces of their genre. To the Pope, Thomas was the persecuted defender of church liberty. To other bishops, he was their champion against royal oppression. To potential allies, he was the principled exile standing against tyranny. Each letter was carefully crafted for its audience, mixing theological argument, emotional appeal, and just enough threat to be taken seriously. Pope Alexander III found himself in an impossible position. Supporting Thomas meant antagonizing Henry, who controlled significant church revenues. Supporting Henry meant abandoning the principle of ecclesiastical independence. The Pope's solution was to support everyone while committing to nothing, a diplomatic dance that required exceptional flexibility. Papal letters arrived at both camps with remarkable regularity, each saying essentially nothing with great eloquence. The Pope understood Thomas's position. He appreciated Henry's concerns. He hoped for reconciliation. He would pray for wisdom. It was diplomatic non-commitment elevated to an art form. Meanwhile, Henry was discovering that exiling Thomas had created more problems than it solved. An absent archbishop couldn't be controlled, couldn't be pressured, and, most annoyingly, couldn't be ignored. Thomas in exile was more troublesome than Thomas in Canterbury. He was a living reproach, a constant reminder that the king's authority had limits. The English church, leaderless and confused, began to fragment. Some bishops remained loyal to Thomas in principle, while being practical about Henry in practice. Others abandoned Thomas entirely, reasoning that an exiled archbishop was no archbishop at all. A few tried to maintain neutrality, which in a polarized situation meant being hated by both sides. Henry's frustration manifested in increasingly creative ways. He threatened the Cistercian order with consequences if they continued to shelter Thomas. The Cistercians, showing the kind of principled flexibility that kept monastic orders solvent, suggested to Thomas that perhaps he might be more comfortable elsewhere. Thomas moved to the Abbey of St. Columba at Sens, where he continued his campaign with undiminished vigour. The conflict had now spread across Europe like a particularly virulent diplomatic disease. Every court had to take a position, or at least pretend to. The Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, offered Henry an alliance against their mutual enemy, the Pope. Other monarchs watched carefully, calculating how they might benefit from this Anglo-French papal crisis. Thomas's life in exile settled into a routine of prayer, correspondence, and occasional moments of doubt, quickly suppressed by renewed certainty. He was like a government in exile, maintaining all the forms of authority without any of the power. He appointed officials to positions he couldn't fill, made decisions about dioceses he couldn't visit, and issued pronouncements that might or might not be obeyed. The financial situation was precarious. Thomas relied on French charity, papal subsidies, and donations from sympathizers. The man who had once commanded revenues that would have funded small kingdoms now worried about paying for parchment. It was humbling, or would have been if Thomas had been inclined to humility rather than righteousness. His health, never robust since his conversion to asceticism, suffered under the strain. The hair shirt, the fasting, the stress of exile, and the French climate combined to create a catalogue of medieval ailments. But illness, like everything else in Thomas's life, became part of his narrative. He was suffering for the church, and he made sure everyone knew it. By 1165, patterns had emerged that would define the years of exile. Henry raged and threatened from England, Thomas excommunicated and proclaimed from France, the Pope mediated and equivocated from Rome. The English church muddled through as best it could. It was a stalemate that satisfied no one but seemed impossible to break. Letters flew between the camps like diplomatic artillery. Henry's messages mixed threats with occasional overtures of reconciliation, usually on terms that would have required Thomas to abandon everything he stood for. Thomas's responses combined theological argument with personal reproach, reminding Henry of their former friendship while condemning his current tyranny. The ordinary business of the English Church continued in a kind of administrative twilight. Bishops were consecrated without their archbishop. Disputes were resolved without proper authority. The machinery of ecclesiastical government creaked along, held together by habit and hope that eventually this crisis would end. But Thomas showed no signs of yielding. If anything, exile had hardened his positions. Free from the compromises required by actually governing, he could maintain absolute principles. Every attempt at negotiation founded on his refusal to accept anything less than complete vindication. He had become not just a defender of church privileges, but their embodiment. As 1165 turned to 1166, both sides settled into their positions like armies in a siege. Henry controlled England, but couldn't control his archbishop. Thomas controlled nothing, but couldn't be controlled. The French king enjoyed the situation, the Pope wished it would go away. The English Church prayed for resolution while preparing for continued chaos. The exit from Northampton had been dramatic, but the exile that followed was dramatically tedious. Great principles were at stake, but they were being contested through letters, legates, and the slow grinding of diplomatic machinery. Thomas had escaped pursuit by clergy and king alike, but he'd discovered that freedom in exile was its own kind of prison. The stage was set for years of stalemate, broken by occasional attempts at reconciliation that would fail because neither man could abandon the positions that defined them. The merchant's son from Cheapside had become the exile of Pontigny and Sens, trading temporal power for spiritual authority, comfort for conviction, and friendship for principle. Whether the trade was worth it remained to be seen. By late 1166, Thomas Becket had been in exile for 2 years, and the initial drama had settled into something worse, routine. Exile, it turned out, was less a grand gesture of defiance and more a slow grind of poverty, irrelevance, and letters that achieved nothing but generated impressive amounts of parchment waste. The mask of the martyred Archbishop was beginning to chafe worse than his perpetual hair shirt. The reality of exile had a way of stripping away illusions. Thomas was discovering that being right was less satisfying when nobody was listening. His excommunications from France landed with all the impact of strongly worded suggestions. His pronouncements about English ecclesiastical affairs were increasingly theoretical, since he had no way to enforce them. He was like a government in exile that everyone had stopped pretending was a government. His daily life at Sens had settled into a numbing routine. Prayers at hours that suggested God was an insomniac. Meals that made his previous fasting seem indulgent. Correspondence that repeated the same arguments to the same people with the same lack of effect. Even martyrdom, it seemed, could become boring if it went on long enough. The financial situation was becoming desperate. Louis's enthusiasm for his English refugee had cooled from active support to benign neglect. Papal subsidies arrived irregularly and were usually smaller than promised. Thomas, who had once managed revenues that could fund armies, now worried about affording ink. It was humbling in ways that spiritual discipline hadn't prepared him for. His health was deteriorating, with the steady determination of someone committed to suffering. The combination of poor diet, worse accommodation, and constant stress was taking its toll. Thomas developed a catalogue of ailments that would have filled a medical textbook, had medieval medical textbooks been more than creative fiction with Latin terminology. But it was the isolation that truly wore on him. In England, even as Chancellor turned defiant Archbishop, he'd been at the centre of events. In exile, he was increasingly peripheral. English affairs continued without him. The Church found ways to function despite lacking its head. Henry's government, which Thomas had helped create, hummed along with mechanical efficiency. He was becoming irrelevant, which for a man of his ambition was worse than persecution. The letters that had once flown from his pen with vindictive energy became repetitive. He was running out of people to excommunicate and arguments to make. The Pope remained diplomatically supportive but practically unhelpful. Other bishops expressed sympathy but offered no solutions. Even his enemies seemed to be losing interest in fighting him. Then, in 1167, something changed. Whether it was desperation, calculation, or genuine spiritual evolution, Thomas began to soften his positions. The absolute principles that had defined his exile showed signs of flexibility. The man who had refused all compromise began to hint that perhaps under certain conditions, with appropriate guarantees, some accommodation might be possible. The change was subtle at first. Letters that had once demanded complete capitulation now spoke of mutual understanding. Conditions that had been non-negotiable became points for discussion. The rhetoric of martyrdom gave way to the language of reconciliation. It was as if Thomas had remembered that he was supposed to be a pastor as well as a prophet. Henry, receiving intelligence about this shift, was initially suspicious. He'd been burned by Thomas's apparent capitulations before, most notably at Clarendon. But his own position was becoming difficult. The absence of an Archbishop of Canterbury was creating administrative problems. The conflict with Thomas was consuming resources and attention better spent elsewhere, and there was always the threat, however distant, of papal intervention. Tentative negotiations began through intermediaries. The issues were complex and interwoven like a particularly vindictive tapestry. The constitutions of Clarendon, which had started the conflict, remained the central obstacle. Thomas insisted they were contrary to canon law. Henry insisted they were ancient customs. Both men were trapped by positions they'd defended too long to abandon easily. But other factors were at play. Louis of France, while enjoying Henry's discomfort, was finding Thomas an increasingly expensive and troublesome guest. The Pope, dealing with his own conflicts with the Holy Roman Emperor, wanted the English situation resolved. Even the English bishops, who had initially been relieved by Thomas's absence, were beginning to feel the lack of proper ecclesiastical authority. The negotiations of 1168 and 1169 were exercises in diplomatic choreography. Meetings were arranged in neutral locations, usually French towns that had the misfortune of being conveniently placed. Henry and Thomas would approach each other like wrestlers, circling, each looking for advantage while pretending to seek reconciliation. The personal dimension complicated everything. These weren't just king and archbishop. They were former friends who knew each other's weaknesses intimately. Every negotiation carried the weight of betrayed friendship. Every concession felt like either vindication or humiliation. The emotional stakes were as high as the political ones. Several times, reconciliation seemed imminent. Terms would be agreed, compromises reached, ceremonies planned. Then something would happen. A misunderstood word, a perceived slight, a sudden return to absolute positions, and the whole edifice would collapse. It was like watching the same play performed repeatedly, with minor variations but the same tragic ending. By early 1170, exhaustion was setting in on all sides. 6 years of conflict had achieved nothing except mutual damage. Henry faced the prospect of permanent excommunication. Thomas faced the prospect of permanent exile. The English Church faced the prospect of permanent dysfunction. Something had to give. The breakthrough came not through grand gestures, but through simple weariness. Both men were older, tireder, and perhaps wiser than they'd been in 1164. The issues that had seemed worth any sacrifice now seemed more negotiable. The principles that had defined their conflict began to seem less absolute when weighed against the costs of maintaining them. In July 1170, at Freteval, Henry and Thomas met for what everyone hoped would be final reconciliation. The meeting was carefully staged to avoid the failures of previous attempts. No detailed negotiations about specific issues, no rehashing of old grievances, just two men, once friends, trying to find a way past the positions that had trapped them. The reconciliation, such as it was more exhaustion than resolution. They agreed to disagree on fundamental issues, while agreeing to stop actively destroying each other. Thomas would return to England. Henry would allow him to function as Archbishop. The constitutions of Clarendon would be quietly ignored rather than formally revoked. It was peace through mutual fatigue. But even as they embraced at Freteval, both men knew this was not true reconciliation. Too much had been said, too much done. The wounds were too deep to heal with diplomatic bandages. They were like divorced couples agreeing to be civil for the children's sake, except the children were the entire English Church. Thomas prepared to return to England with emotions that his chroniclers struggled to describe. Triumph? He was returning unbroken. Defeat? He'd achieved none of his absolute goals. Relief? The exile was ending. Foreboding? The conflict wasn't resolved, merely suspended. He was going home, but to what? The mask of the martyred Archbishop, worn so long it had become part of him, was slipping. Beneath it was a man exhausted by his own intransigence, worn down by exile but still absolutely convinced of his righteousness. He had played the role of God's champion so completely that he'd forgotten it was a role. Or perhaps it had never been a role at all. As November 1170 approached, Thomas made his preparations for return. He gathered his few possessions, such as they were. He said farewell to the French clerics who'd sheltered him. He prepared for a homecoming that everyone knew would be dangerous. Henry had agreed to his return, but agreement and welcome were different things. The Channel crossing of December 1170 would be his last. The man who boarded the ship at Ouessant was fundamentally changed from the one who'd fled Northampton 6 years earlier. The exile had stripped away everything except his core convictions. He was returning not as Thomas the administrator or Thomas the politician, but as Thomas the Archbishop, refined by suffering into something harder and more brittle than before. England waited with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The common people, who loved religious drama, prepared to welcome their returning Archbishop. The nobles, who had enjoyed his absence, prepared for renewed conflict. The bishops, caught as always in the middle, prepared for whatever chaos would follow. Henry, in Normandy, prepared for reports of his archbishop's behaviour, with the resignation of a man who knew he'd made a mistake but couldn't admit it. The story slows now, in these final weeks of 1170. The great conflict has played out, leaving only its consequences. Thomas sails toward England, toward Canterbury, toward a destiny that anyone could see coming, except, apparently, the participants. The mask has slipped, revealing not a different face but the same one, hardened by exile into something that could no longer bend without breaking. In the gathering December darkness, as Thomas's ship approaches the English coast, we can see the tragedy complete but not yet concluded. Two brilliant men had destroyed their friendship on the altar of principle. A kingdom had been divided by a question that had no good answer. A merchant's son had risen to the highest ecclesiastical office and discovered that some heights are too dangerous to occupy. The exile is ending, but nothing is resolved. The mask is off, but what it revealed was only another mask, worn so long it had become the face. Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, is coming home. What happens next will transform him from a difficult priest into an eternal symbol. But that transformation requires one more act of violence, one more betrayal, one more demonstration that in medieval politics, some conflicts can only end when one party stops breathing. But that is a story for another night. For now, let us leave Thomas on his ship, approaching the white cliffs of Dover, preparing for a homecoming that would last exactly 29 days. He stands at the rail, perhaps, looking toward the land he'd fled, the kingdom he'd defied, the cathedral where he would soon make his final statement about the relationship between church and crown. The mask slips one last time, and beneath it is the face of a man who knows how his story ends, but is too committed to his role to change the script. He is Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, and he is going home to die, though he doesn't know it yet. Or perhaps he does, and that's why he's going. Sleep well and dream of principles so pure they poison friendships, of exiles that change nothing except the exiled, of masks worn so long they become more real than the faces beneath them. Dream of Thomas and Henry, two brilliant men who could reshape kingdoms, but couldn't save their friendship, who could see every move in the political game except the one that mattered. Tomorrow will bring its own conflicts, its own principles worth defending, its own friendships worth preserving. But tonight, in the last days of 1170, all possibilities narrow to a single point. A ship approaching Dover, carrying an archbishop toward his cathedral and his destiny. The rest, as they say, is history. Brutal history. The kind best contemplated from the safety of sleep. Good night. Thank you for listening, one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace.